Good morning, everyone. Another beautiful day here in Santa Barbara. So I'm going to jump right into doing the deep dive lectures, and I'll be doing the first deep dive that we've had, which will be on the uninhabitable Earth. But I want to take a little time to explain what the deep dive lectures are, how they work, how you can get the most out of them, use them to study, use how you can study them the best and all. But first, let me just take literally a minute or two telling you the rationale for them. And I think I've explained this once before in a previous video, but just to make sure, hopefully you've watched it, but to remind you. So imagine a traditional class, a small seminar. Well, this is designed to kind of emulate that in a way. So how does a small seminar work? Well, first, I would come in as the lecturer and, or in seminar leader, sorry. And as the seminar leader, I would deliver usually a 5 or 10 minute intro, sort of framing what we're going to talk about that day. Then I would ask people for their responses. People would respond. Usually the way I conduct a seminar like that, after someone makes a statement, I ask if anyone else, has a comment on that, or they want to elaborate on it or add to it or raise related questions. Once that happens, then I usually jump in and respond to what the person or people have said regarding it. And that's important because, well, first let me then talk about what we're doing, and then I'll explain how the rationale works there. The idea is the same kind of thing. So instead of me coming into a small room with 10 or 20 people in it, I deliver it at the opening remark as a lecture. That's what you that's what you listened to before you watched The Uninhabitable Earth, that short little video that I delivered. That's my opening statement. You've then also read the material, so you made comments. Not in person in a seminar, but rather you made comments to YouTube. And I asked people, as you know, to respond to what other people had said, so that, again, like a small seminar where someone would make a statement, other people would respond to what was said. And then finally, I would respond. And that's what I'm doing right now. That's what the deep dives are. They are my response to what everyone has said, plus the reading itself. And if you think about it, that's kind of necessary because, I assigned that reading, I assigned all the readings and the films, but you really haven't heard me talk much about them. Yeah, I gave that opening little statement, but I would like to elaborate and talk about them more. I could have done that just as a lecture. I could have had an hour-long lecture on me talking about the uninhabitable Earth. I think this is a better way of doing it because I think, one, I can deliver that lecture material. I can tell you other things, which I'm going to do today. But I think it's far better to have you sort of, decide what I should talk about. Your questions are going to point me in the direction of what to talk about. That strikes me as far more interesting, well, for you, but for me too. In other words, as I read your responses to this material, it gives me a better indication of what you're thinking about. And with the climate crisis, that's really important because it's not just me talking about the percentage, parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's instead me trying to get a handle on what you're feeling, what you're thinking about it, what you want to do about it or whatever. And I can only do that by listening to you. And the only way that I can listen to you in a class this large that's being done remotely and asynchronously is by reading you and reading what you've said. So that's what we're going to do today. That's how the deep dives are going to work. It's going to be me going through your comments and talking about them. So let's go to the website. So let me get my glasses on here. I'm scrolling down. This is the syllabus page, the main syllabus page. Let's go to week 2. That's where we are here. Click on it. And if you go down here to week 2, you'll note that when we get to lectures, same as last week in the sense that there are 2 little lectures by me. These are part of the Climate and Generation little lecture series I put together. They're different than what we're doing. In addition, I note here you are to watch both of these deep dive lectures by me. One is on the uninhabitable Earth, that's the reading. The other is on Before the Flood and an Inconvenient Sequel, the documentaries. There is no link here right now. There will be when you see this site. Why is that? Well, because I haven't made this video yet. So once this video is finished and uploaded, then I will be able to give you a link to it. But what I can do here is give you a link to this. The written comments to which Ken is replying can be found here. So we click that. These are, it's a simplified page here, and I want to show you why in a minute. But these are the deep dives. So in all honesty here, this statement, that's a statement made by a person in the class. As we go down here, there are more statements made by people in the class. I am going to go through these statements and offer a comment on each. Just like if we were in a small seminar and someone started off by saying, of all honesty, and gave their little statement, then, you know, everyone else would have a chance to reply. A number of people replied to this particular one, and then I will weigh in. So something to keep in mind here is that I tried to select interesting ones from the comments that we have, but there are an awful lot of them, and you know, they may not always be the best ones, and you know, unfortunately, hold on, let me pop back on the screen here. You know, hopefully they're good representative ones, but they may not always be the most, and you may not always, in the whole course of the term, we may not get to one of your comments at all, or may get to one of your comments multiple times. It's just hard to say. But hopefully the ones that I show, and I've gone through an awful lot to pick them, will be interesting and representative of, you know, kind of what people are thinking in the class. Now, one issue that we have with this class is that we do not have PDFs available for everything. Now, if you watch the format video that I showed you, that I made for you, you know that you can take the other lecture material and easily print those out as PDFs. What I mean by that is like the climate and generation series I told you about. You can print that whole thing out as a PDF. You can print out actually the introductory short little lectures I did on the course readings and the course documentaries. You can also access this material, and in terms of developing a strategy for how to work with this and study it, I'm going to go through a couple things here. Why this is important, let me be very clear. This material, i.e. the deep dives, i.e. this particular lecture, may certainly show up on the quizzes. To clarify that, though, it is a little confusing because this week we have now moved on to a new reading, which is about the local situation with climate change here in Santa Barbara and Ventura counties. Even though we're on a new reading, this week you're responsible for the deep dive on a reading which is from last week, David Wallace Wells. So that's a little confusing. You're not going to be asked about Wallace Wells again, any particulars from that reading, unless it's things that I discuss in this lecture. It's kind of an odd way of doing it, but there's really, you know, kind of no other way of doing this, because you have to give me comments to reply on, but I can't comment until you've given them to me, but by then we're already past that reading. So the good news, I think, pedagogically, I think it all dovetails together and meshes together. So it's a nice way of sort of transitioning from one to the other. But be aware when you go to the page where we just were, you have to do the reading for this week and then the deep dives for last week, in essence. So you're responsible for that. So the question is then how best to work with this material. Well, you don't have PDFs, and there's no way of me providing you with the full PDF. And the reason for that is, for the other material, say the climate and generation series, I wrote all that out ahead of time, so that's all up on the website. So you can print that out as a PDF, there's no problem. If you were in English 22 before last term, you know that we had extensive PDFs, and that was because of the great work of two students, UCSB students, who were trying to keep ahead of the class by going through the closed captioning file for every one of the lectures I delivered, and then generating out of that PDF material, which I uploaded as a PDF. You think about it, I can't really do that here because as soon as this deep dive gets finished, as soon as today's lecture that I'm doing gets finished, I'm going to upload it to YouTube, so I don't have time to make a PDF and all. but there are a couple things that you can use that you might find useful. So let me go back again to the website. Okay, here we are. Let's go down, and again, what you're looking at are comments here for all these from all these folks. What you can do is print this as a PDF. So how you would go about that is very simple. Just go to your browser and say print, and then you have the option, of course, of printing it as a PDF, in which case it creates an electronic file that you can use a PDF app for, or you could print it out on paper. So I won't go through the process here since I already did. This that I'm showing you here is a PDF that I created from that material. See, it starts with all honesty, the same thing again. Now, what I did here when I printed it, and I'm sure you know from having printed things in the past, you have an option as to set the size of what you printed. I could have made it full size, but it would have been very large here. It would have gone all the way across. So I reduced this down to, I think, 60% of its size. Why did I do that? Well, let me just show you here. Let me back up first and draw attention to something else. One of the reasons that the website is so sparse and that there's nothing on it and all is that it lends itself to being viewed this way. So we're not looking again at the website now, but a PDF. It looks pretty much the same. And in fact, the only vestige that this was actually from a website is this little back to syllabus button. There is no other here. So the website is all designed that way, and I think it kind of blurs the distinction between a book and a website, which is one of my goals. But also, it makes this very viewable as a PDF. In other words, you might have printed out PDFs before, where there's a lot of stuff on the page and a sidebar and all. It's a complete mess. This is not like that. And if I go down here, you can see, by the way, this is, these are multiple pages here, and that's how it works. So why did I print this out smaller? Well, if you let's say you printed it out on a page like this, on a piece of paper. Well, you have all this excess material space on the page to write notes, to circle things and all. And given that the font size is larger, this will still be very visible. So if you actually have this on an 8.5 by 11 piece of letter paper, this distance across here is going to be just about the same as a paperback book, and it's entirely readable at that amount. And furthermore, the line length has been designed to be the same as a book. But then you still have all this on either side. This goes the same if you don't print it out, but instead you go ahead and print it as a PDF and then use some sort of PDF editing app in the same situation, whether you're doing it on a laptop or tablet or whatever. That's how it works. So hopefully, go back to me again, that will work particularly well for you if you wanted to actually have something in front of you. Now, the downside of that, and I'll address it in a moment, is you're not getting what I'm saying here. You're getting what I'm speaking to. But you still could use that as sort of a focal point where you do your notes and everything. I want to also note that as I expressed before, because I think it's an important issue, that this material has been designed to run on a phone as well as running it like I am now actually I'm using a desktop computer here. So I'm going to show you how this looks on a phone, both where you can see the video, but how you can shift from video back and forth to a PDF. So what I've done is, let me show you here. This is me talking, but I've also uploaded the PDF to my phone, and I'm just switching from one to the other. That's the same material that we just saw as a PDF scrolling here. So that's not the website. Let me just click here and show you. That's the actual PDF running. And the goal was to make this, you can see it as a PDF here, to look as much as possible like, a regular reading experience that you would do on your phone, something like if you're reading a Kindle app. So, the same sort of width on text and all, but let me just switch. This is to an actual book that I'm in the process of reading at the moment, running on a Kindle. And you can see how that looks, and then we can go back to how the PDF looks. So again, it looks about the same as if you were, just watching if you were just looking at it as a book, and also if you were looking at the website. So hopefully that will make sense to you, and you can use it that way. So in theory, then you could do this all on your phone. You could be watching the lecture. You could pause for a moment, do what I did, just click right over and look at the PDF and make comments there and all. It might be kind of difficult to do on a phone, but you could do it. And I try to do everything that I can on a phone nowadays, so I might be open to that. Or you could do something else. You could print it out in its paper form, and then you could look at it on a phone, watch the video while you're writing down on paper. But again, what you're looking at there, the transcript that you have, it's not a transcript, it's the comments that I'm commenting on. There's something else that you can do if you actually want to get to the words that I'm saying here. So I can't do this with the lecture that I'm doing now, since it hasn't been made yet, but I can show you this on another lecture that I've done. So let's go back to where I was. So this was the PDF. I have another tab open here. This is one of the lectures that I'm giving, and this is, I had that open already. I'll show you how it works. So if you go to YouTube, and you have to do this from the YouTube site itself. This is, the talk that I'm giving here. If you scroll down here, you'll notice that it may look different depending on the width of your screen, so you may have like a sidebar here and all. But if you go to these options here, you may not have ever seen this before. Well, so let me just show you something. This is the closed captioning file.
Single lifetime.
So this is what I'm actually saying here.
That the people who caused this problem are still alive and still making it worse.
I'm not sure.
I want to talk to you about how this happened. Not the
blame YouTube on that, not me. But normally there'd be closed captioning there. And the problem with closed captioning is, well, there it is. That's the words that I'm saying, but you can't get access to that. But YouTube does allow you to get access to it. So again, if you go down here and you hit Open Transcript, what this does is open up a full transcript of what I'm actually saying. It actually has here time stamping, and that makes it kind of awkward to have the time stamping there, but YouTube is also taking care of that. Toggle timestamps, and now what you have here is the whole lecture written out of what I'm doing. And what's great, if you're doing it online here, you can just go ahead and see if I can scroll down here a little and do both at the same time. You can bounce around from different places, so as you go through this, it actually moves the video through at the same time. Now, how could you use this? Well, as a study aid, if you were watching the lectures with me and you found something important, like here I talk about, this thing about a quart of oil and all, and you wanted to highlight that, you could just go ahead and highlight, or to copy it rather, highlight anything you want here and copy and paste that into your study document if you're creating a PDF or something. This could be useful if you're looking for all the important points about what I've said, and I'll bounce back to me again. So if you're looking for important facts, if I quote like a number or something, well, you could go ahead and grab that from here and go ahead and again put it into whatever thing you're using to study. You could even, in theory, and you could do this on the phone, it could be kind of hard, but if you're working like with a laptop or so, you could have the PDF that I just showed you that you could create of the comments that that I'm commenting on. But you could go ahead, and if you're using like a PDF app, you could go ahead and cut and paste my little particular commentary, like a number or something important, right onto that document. So you do have this. Now, it's not perfect, right? Because this is generated through, voice recognition technology is what YouTube uses. So it will make mistakes. But about that, a couple things. First, if you've been paying attention to what's happening in recent years, voice recognition technology is getting better and better. That's what makes Siri and Alexa work. So there's a big investment in making that work. The other thing is I've made an investment here in trying to make it work too, in that, well, you can't usually see it, but right above me here is a little shotgun mic hanging, and that mic is very close, just a few 2 inches from my mouth. And the reason for that, and it's a good quality shotgun mic, and it's going through, I don't know if you can see it over here, that little thing flashing there. Is actually a dedicated preamp that I'm running the shotgun mic through. Why I'm doing all that is to get better audio quality. Computer programming used to be a hobby of mine. I guess it still is. And there's an old adage, you probably heard it, garbage in, garbage out. The same thing works with programming as it does here. And what I mean by that, if you give it poor audio, you're going to get poor voice recognition. But if you give it a really good a good audio file, the recognition will be better. And that's my goal here. And my goal for doing that was to make this more accessible to a range of people who are variously abled. And what I mean by that is, well, if people can't see this material, if people can't hear this material, then I want them to be able to read it as accurately as possible. So that's why I've spent time with that. Okay, I spent a good bit of time today on this material, on how to approach this material and how to use it best, because it's the first time around, and I want you to try to get the most out of it. You don't have to do any of this, right? If you have a good memory, you can just watch this. And a lot of people come into lectures, and I can see they just sit and watch me intently. And I know some of them have done very well doing that because they have good memories and all. Other people need to be taking notes and want to take notes, and then you have something to review. And that's a perfectly good strategy. And different people approach things differently. If where we are right now, you're going into the second week, you already have seen your performance on the weekly quizzes. If you weren't happy with it, well, then you might want to double down and think of strategies for helping with this material. And hopefully what I just showed you will do just that. So, okay, let's go back to, see here. We are, and I want to go back to where we were, the deep dive. So I'm going to put this up while I get a drink of tea here. I am not going to go through and read these, right? I could do that, but it wouldn't be, it wouldn't be a very rewarding experience for you or for me. And the thing is, you can just go ahead and pause and read these if you like. So let me jump right in. Many people had comments like this, that they knew things like, the person notes here, I knew that the Earth is warming up, I know the rate at which it is warming is accelerating, and so forth. And as a consequence, this person thought it would just be a redundant embellishment of these 3 points. But, 2.5 paragraphs deep into the uninhabitable Earth was how incredibly pretentious my attitude toward the subject had been. There's so much more to learn. Well, that's one of the reasons that I wanted to comment on this particular comment, and a number of people have made this point that they learned an awful lot, and Davis Wallace Wells covers an enormous amount of material very quickly. And let me be very clear in framing this so that it's controversial what he says. Not that the things that he's talking about couldn't happen or that he's making them up. That's not the case. They could happen and he's not making them up. That is not to say they will happen or that they will all happen in the way that he, fears that they might. Certainly they could. But we need to realize that these are just possibilities. But that being said, they are real possibilities. This isn't like reading a sci-fi or cli-fi novel where people are just saying, all the horrible things that could happen. They could. And as this person rightly notes, he makes us realize that many parts of the world, such as Bangladesh, have next to no hope surviving the current rate of climate change. Well, that's something that we don't think about a lot. Sorry, I just looked at, I'm going to make sure that I'm following back and forth with the text here, but I want to talk to you too. We tend to see this from an American perspective. That's our perspective. Why wouldn't we? But there's a global perspective at work here. In countries like Bangladesh, and we're going to visit Bangladesh throughout this course in different ways. One, through a documentary you may have seen called The True Cost that talks about working conditions there in fast fashion. But Bangladesh, 40% of Bangladesh is already flooded any given year. 40%, and it's a low-lying country, and there are countries that are lower lying than that, and there's a problem. But again, what this person noted early on there's more here than sea level rise. Sea level rise is important, but David Wallace Wells is going through a range of different things. I started with this comment because this person also, hold on a second, I will not make this mistake again. This person also notes here, Wallace Wells firmly grounds his readers in the hard reality that we face. The world is on track to surpass the goals set by the Paris Agreement. So that's absolutely right. So it's useful to think about that for a moment. So what's the Paris Agreement? And by the way, this is me now lecturing, so I'm introducing new material here that you could get quizzed on, but it's important that we talk about this, which we're doing. So, 2015, the nations of the world all got together in Paris, or representative of them, over 190 countries, and decided to come up with a policy for addressing the climate crisis. Now, this was called COP21, which is the Committee of the Parties, so it's a committee of all the parties on the planet. And, it happens every year, and what you might find vexing here, and should find vexing, so this is 2015, COP21. It has been going on for 21 years now. And moreover, before that, way back in 1988, the nations of the world decided to put together a panel to try to figure out what the situation is with the climate crisis. And this is 1988. It's called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's the IPCC. You may have heard of it. What that was scientists, thousands of scientists, really, putting all the scientific knowledge that we had together and aggregating it together and trying to make sense of it. Now, the IPCC is an unusual scientific group in the sense that they generally do no research at all. So how do they work? Well, there's lots of research that is done on the climate crisis, and what the IPCC does is that it aggregates it together and it looks at it. So there may be, with sea level rise, there may be hundreds of articles coming out in a given year on it. Well, they look at them all and try to figure out, well, what's the big takeaway from them, and what's most credible here? What can we imagine is going to happen? What is happening with sea level rise? So the IPCC, has been putting out those reports, and they do it. It's not like it's not like COP21. The COPs, they don't meet every year, but every few years they come out with a new one, and there will be one coming out pretty soon, actually. And what this material then was for policymakers, and i.e. businesses, but principally like the countries of the world and what they would do. So once the IPCC came out with its reports, then the nations of the world began meeting on this every year, figuring out what the heck we should do. It's a long-winded way of saying, well, the really disturbing thing is we didn't actually conclusively do anything until 2015, after a couple decades of talking about this and making some changes, but nothing sufficient. So at COP21, nations of the world said that the goal is to stop climate change before it got to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that the absolute outside goal should be to stop it before it hit 2 degrees Celsius. Well, as this person notes here, I'll go back to this, the world is on track to surpass the goals set by the Paris Agreement. Absolutely right. Actually, we are at 1 degree Celsius rise already. So when has that been taking place? Well, in my, you may have noticed I already addressed this in some ways in my little series on climate and generation, that it's been happening really since 1880 or so in a trackable way, since we've had good numbers on it. But most of it's been in my lifetime. And you can alternately look at it from like post-World War II, and a great and overwhelming majority of it has been since then, like 85% since after the Second World War. So we're already at 1%. To think that we could stop it at 1.5 is just unrealistic at this point. In fact, even if we stopped everything today, it would continue to move forward and continue to warm for a variety of reasons. But the fact is, we're not stopping it. And this is a sobering reality, but we're in a position in some ways to talk about the efficacy of COP21 now because it was 5 years ago. And even though, everyone was happy when we left there were a number of people, myself included, who were very concerned because it sounded good, but there was no immediate plans for doing it. But the most important thing, there was nothing forcing the nations of the world to do it. There was no enforcement mechanism in there. So countries had the option of doing what they could or not. Well, 5 years out, we would have expected they would have worked that out. Unfortunately, not much has happened. The biggest place that it hasn't happened was the United States because, for 4 of those 5 years, Donald Trump was the president. He was a climate change denier and pulled us out of COP21. So the U.S., we were kind of off the table in a certain sense. But the rest of the world, a lot of countries were on board for it. A number of countries have made real gains, places like Germany, for example, but not so much. And that's scary because what it means is we can expect at least a 1.5 or 2 or more. And David Wallace Wells, the kind of thought experiment that is this article, is thinking, well, what happens if we, as I noted in my introduction, if we go more than that, what will that be like? And that's what we have to confront now. Yeah, so let me, so I don't spend the whole time lecturing and get to address your things, let me move forward. This person notes I felt more worried and scared rather than jumping up to take action. Although his article said nothing but the truth, that left me feeling more discouraged than anything else. Yeah, as explained in the article, the actions that need to be taken now are more drastic because the action should have been started years ago, but instead the health of our world and atmosphere was put on the back burner. Well, first, well said. If I went through that quickly, just pause and go back to it because I think it was a really good statement. Two things from that, and again, great comment. Let's talk with the first part. This person note, after reading it, felt more worried and scared rather than jumping up to action. That is a very common response to the climate crisis. In other words, being petrified, I guess, in the sense of, when you're petrified, you're frozen, right? That's what it means. Well, I think a lot of people are because the thing is so darn scary and so big and worldwide. And because of what I just said, nothing is being done about it. Things are being done, but not nearly a sufficient amount is being done about it. People are just overwhelmed and not knowing what to do. Well, as I noted, with my introductory material, you're going to feel that way now, and you're going to feel that way for the next 2 weeks. But it's necessary to give you a grounding in how bad the situation is or can be, which is what Wallace Wells sets out to do. But then there are things that you can do, and that, they're very real things that we're going to talk about. And it's absolutely the case that we can solve this now, but we have to think hard about it, and we have to be willing to make changes and all. The second part of this comment a person made, said that, I'll go back to it because it's such a good statement. As explained in here, the actions that need to be taken now are more drastic because the action should have been started years ago, but instead the health of our world and atmosphere was put on the back burner. Yeah, that's just such a good statement. I mean, look, we've known about this my entire lifetime. I turned 61 last year. Johnson, said, I think it was in 1965, LBJ said that climate change was real, and he addressed this on the floor of Congress. This was over 50 years ago. And we've known that this was an issue. People were addressing it, and I'll talk about in future the lectures I'm giving. People were addressing this issue from my childhood on. Not necessarily with climate change, but we knew we had a problem with fossil fuels. We knew we had a problem with point source pollution, and we were trying to resolve it. I mean, Jimmy Carter in 1979 put solar cells on the White House to, try to get the rest of the country to go along. We haven't done anything to speak of regarding this. And as the person noted here, I won't bounce back to it, we should have started this years ago. And that makes it a bigger problem. It could have, we could have mitigated this significantly if we had taken action when we started to, like when Carter was, moving on forward with this. 40 years ago, we'd be in a very different world now. We would have had time to do things, for example, and I'll talk about why cars are a problem, but we would have had time to phase cars out. Cars would have been gone away by 2015. And what I mean by that, we would have had much more effective mass transportation and other options available to us. And why are cars so bad? Well, I'll talk about this. I have already. A quarter of our personal climate footprints come from that. So we would have had time to do that. We don't have time to do those things now. And when you see people like AOC saying, we have to act in this decade, well, we do have to act in this decade. Why? Well, we have not acted already. And the actions that we need to take have to be very dramatic now. We could have very nicely transitioned into this new world that we need in the last 40 or 50 years, in the last 40 years especially. And we were poised to. And the technology was there. It's not like wind turbines are new. I mean, sure, they use some rare earth materials now that weren't available before, and the efficiency is up. And you can say the same with solar cells, but they were effective back then. So that puts us in an unfortunate situation now, and that should be depressing, but it is the reality of it. So let's go to the next comment. Yeah, I've come to understand that my mother and grandparents' generation set my generation up for failure due to not taking into consideration their anthropogenic climate crisis, anthropogenic climate impact. It is in the hands of my generation to save the planet. Yeah. And then this person talks about having children in the future and what it would be for them. Comment here I thought is great. Take, for instance, ads and signs you see regarding tobacco. By the way, we're going to talk about the tobacco industry. We're actually going to have a film on it and how it relates here called Merchants of Doubt. But don't worry about that now. Person makes a great comment. These ads use an alarmist tone to encourage people to stop consuming them. Perhaps setting up warning signs on gas pumps and flight tickets, such as those seen on cigarette packs, would motivate my generation and others to make a change on our Earth. Wow, really good said. Really good points. Let me get to that one. I'll go back to the generation thing, but that point. A couple classes ago, someone noticed that, the label you see on the side of cigarette pack is cigarettes kill, What would it be if every car that you bought had that as part of the paint on the side of it, those sort of warnings? Cigarettes kill, a quarter of your climate footprint comes from cars and all. I think we'd be, thinking about it differently. Or, 50 million people are killed or injured in cars every year. Well, yeah, and you can bet that the automobile industry would fight those every bit as much as the tobacco industry fought them. But the fact is, people don't realize it. And by the way, those warnings would be on a Tesla too, and not singling out Tesla, but electric cars too, because they don't solve the problem in the way we would hope they would. And we'll get to that in the future. But unfortunately, a lot of people just aren't aware of it. So it does raise a question of how you make them aware of it. People, think, if they buy like an electric car, the problem's solved and all, but it's not. Getting to this person's original statement about, that the generation before her, parents and grandparents, set I'm reading here, I won't go back to it, set my generation up for failure due to not taking into consideration their anthropogenic climate change impact. It's in the hands of my generation to save the planet Earth. A really really well said and on point. And that, I did those 5 little lectures on climate and generation plus the intro, but I could have avoided all of them and just, not had to do them, but just to say what that person just said. That my generation, the generation of this person's, mother and grandparents, set your generation up for failure because we didn't do it. We could have done these things, but we didn't. People knew, but people were in denial in the sense of, denying the reality of it because it meant that life has to change. Life does have to change now, and it's up to your generation to do it. And if you're thinking that's not fair, it's because it's anything but fair. I won't go into too much detail because I don't want to duplicate what I said in the climate and generation thing. But I wanted to start with those, and why I started with that, put together that little lecture series to begin with, because you are a particular audience. UCSB students, for the most part, are, you're probably, most of the people in the room are 20-ish, I would say, give or take a couple years, right? 18 to 22. And there's some older people in the room. But for the most part, that's the demographic here. And your generation has to face this as a generation. And it's different than my generation and what's being demanded of you and all. So, yeah. Again, I don't want to go too much into detail with that. Let me jump to so another comment here. One of the most eye-opening results of climate change that he mentions, David Wallace Wells, is heat deaths. So, note, by the way, that this comment here was in fact longer. It's not like this person just did that short thing. But what I did is I pulled out things from different comments, and because I just don't want to overwhelm you with a lot, and I wanted to keep focus on certain things. This is a good example here of something that David Wallace Wells does a good job with, I think. And that is, most people just assume that the climate crisis is about rising sea level. It's not. And that's not the stuff we have to worry about as much, really. What I mean by that is, yes, we need to worry about sea level rise. But first, I think there's the notion in the developed world, places like the U.S., that we can deal with sea level pretty well ourselves. And what I mean by that is we can build, superstructure on our coast, kind of dike-like things, and to stop tide and all. Last I heard, I think last year, so I don't want to say it if I'm not getting it right, but I think it was last year, the city of New York has dedicated itself to a $10 billion project to protect itself from flooding, which it's already encountered by way of Superstorm Sandy, which was almost a decade ago. So we can kind of do that, and we probably will do that. And I think in certain ways it made people less worried about, climate change in the U.S. First, it's a good example of environmental and climate justice because there are many parts of the planet that will not be able to do that with sea level rise. There are whole nations in the Pacific that are going away now, that are literally being flooded over. And countries like, as was mentioned earlier, Bangladesh, it's a very poor country. It is not able to do that sort of infrastructure and all. It's just not going to happen. But beyond that, it doesn't, so as a consequence, I think Americans really weren't too worried about it. We should be. A lot of Florida is going to go away, because it's going to be flooded. But it's also the case that we didn't think about these other things like heat deaths. And, David Wallace Wells talks about it. And, literally, I guess I'm trying to remember when it was. I think it was this summer. I'm here in downtown Santa Barbara. On the other side of the mountains there, it hit 118 degrees on one day. You might remember over the summer we also had the hottest day ever recorded on the planet, which was also in California over in Death Valley. But 118 degrees, and then much hotter, and even hotter in other places. That would make portions of the planet simply uninhabitable. Death Valley would be an example of where people just may not be able to live anymore. Now, you can, put it in terms of a wealthy country like the U.S., well, people just move away from there. Well, first, people are going to be doing lots of moving. That's called, and we'll talk about it in detail, climate migration. And climate migrations means that people, for one reason or another, will not be able to live where they are because of changes to the climate. Death Valley might be an example. A lot of coastal cities will be an example. Florida, which is a very sort of low state, they're It's not like the Appalachian Mountains go down into it, so it's pretty flat. But huge portions of the coast will not be inhabited, so people are going to have to move away from there. And these things that we don't think about, like heat death. So that's different than the fires, right? We'll talk about the fires, and in fact, this whole second week, we're talking about the impact of climate in California, specifically by way of the fires. But what that means is people are going to be in motion, millions of them, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people are going to be migrating in the course of this century. The problem with that, migration means not just moving from Death Valley to another part of California. I'm sure, the wealthy people in Death Valley will be able to do just that. But we're talking about people, in some cases in countries, like I mentioned, in the Pacific, that are going to go away. In places like, Bangladesh, it'll be less and less habitable. Those people are going to have to move out of their countries. There may not be a country left or a very habitable one. That raises problems, right? I mean, we've just come from a presidential era. Even though it's not over, Biden won't be sworn in for a few days, but we've come from an era where we wanted to discourage anyone from migrating at all into the United States. So, we built this wall along our southern border. Well, but people are going to have to migrate. People are going to want to migrate. David Wallace Wells starts off with this sort of chain reaction of things in the Middle East, the rise of ISIS and people moving to Europe, a million people there, and the sort of implications that had in terms of anti-immigration and racism and everything else. You may not think that, immigration policy is something that we have to think about in terms of the climate crisis, but it's going to be huge. I mean, people are going to be moving around on the planet. It's just going to be a reality of the situation. So we haven't thought about these things sufficiently. I think that's safe to say. So let me go back to page here. Oops. Okay. Okay. So this person notes that the person had read this in high school. I'm now older and more in control of my daily actions, understanding the consequences. The section that I found most intriguing was the unbreathable air. I feel as though many people are aware of the grave condition the Earth is in, but rather accept it as a latter problem for future generations. Yeah, jump back to me again. Well, yeah. Sir, first, I think, I don't know how to put this. I think you may have been aware of this situation earlier in your life. And again, I'm speaking to you as a 20-ish group. But I think now you're in a position to revisit this in the way that this person literally revisited this article by David Wallace Wells and understand it in a more complete way and be able to consider your options in a way as adults. So one of the reasons that I like this course with you as an audience, because I think you're right at the point where you're able to completely understand this and think about actions on it, and I think that's great. This person found most intriguing the unbreathable air. Well, yeah, again, it's not just about sea level rise. Air is going to be a problem, and in part, this is something that we've known about for an awful long time. And it was unrelated to the climate. It was thought unrelated to the climate crisis, but not. And I just want to clarify it because people will confuse these things, and climate change deniers will intentionally confuse these things with you. So when you burn fossil fuels, so let's talk about burning oil in a car, processed oil is gasoline. Well, that sends certain things into the air. Sulfur dioxide is one of them. So I won't actually put together a lecture series on this, but because sulfur is in oil in small amounts, there's more of it in coal, what we call high sulfurous coal especially. But that sulfur in any event combines with oxygen and becomes sulfur dioxide, not carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide. There are other things. Nitrogen does the same, but sulfur dioxide, let's talk about that one for a moment. We tend to call that a point source pollution. Why? Because you can pinpoint the source of that pollution. With respect to cars, you can do it with great detail. It's that big around. It's your tailpipe. That's where it's coming out of. That's a dangerous, toxic material. because it's lighter than air. It goes out of your tailpipe, goes up into the sky, and unfortunately, it usually stops when it gets water vapor combined with it, as in clouds, as in what will become rain clouds. And that sulfur dioxide turns into sulfuric acid. And that will rain down on the planet during rain. We call that acid rain. So that's point source pollution that's coming from all the sources of burning of those fossil fuels that contain sulfur, like cars, but also power plants that generate electricity that are burning, say, coal. And that's a real problem. And we've known for a while, and if you actually go back and look at photographs, say, of LA in the 1960s, you can see a huge smog problem. I think for most people, smog came on the scene as like the public awareness of it in the 1960s, and often LA was thought of as like one of the epicenters of it. We actually came up with a way of greatly reducing that, and that is by putting catalytic converters onto our cars, which can actually convert sulfur dioxide into carbon dioxide, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But it was a good thing, and it reduced smog dramatically. But there are other parts of the world that are still dealing with smog in a big way, and of course the go-to example in the 21st would be Beijing. Beijing has cleaned up, and in general, China has cleaned up that air pollution problem in a very short period of time, remarkably well, as did we in the United States. It's still there, and it's still there in the United States as well. But in other countries where they're not as wealthy, people are still burning fossil fuels directly without any. And by the way, power plants can also, they use something called scrubbers, which can take the sulfur out of a lot of the sulfur out of the atmosphere. It's different than a catalytic converter, but it works the same way. There are other countries where they still burn a lot of coal and things like that, but burn it directly, as in like put a pile on a stove and burn it, or actually put a pile on the ground and burn it. Like Mongolia would be an example where coal is very inexpensive and people can't afford other sources of energy. And that presents a problem because it's just pumping all that, sulfur into the atmosphere and often individually impacting people. So this is a fact that 1 in 10 people on the planet, last I checked the number was 785 million, which is about 1 in 10. 1 in 10 people on the planet have a health problem that's equivalent to smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. What is that from? Well, they're burning either something like coal in their house, but often they're burning for light oil in the form of kerosene, like kerosene lamps. They're very common across the developing world. And the problem, though, is you're in a closed place putting out that sulfur dioxide and all, and people are breathing that in, and that's just as bad as smoking a couple packs of cigarettes a day, and it has the same related health problems. It's a social justice issue because, well, it's countries that are poorer that are forced to do this, and as we're going to see, social justice affects different groups of people, and in this case, particularly, sadly, women and children, because in the domestic sphere they're often inside more than other folks. So they're the ones principally being harmed by it. So that's a problem that's here with climate change. We often sort of focus on climate change and don't think about other issues like that, but it's important, and we need to think about point source pollution in addition to whatever you're doing, whether you're burning kerosene in that kerosene lamp, or in a car, or power plants burning it. That's putting CO2 in the atmosphere, which is adding to the greenhouse effect, causing a warming of the planet, but then all the other significant climate changes that have brought us to the point of being in a climate crisis. So, but yeah, great point. Let me switch back to this one here so that, this person found Unbreathable Earth most intriguing, and it should be. Yeah, David Wallace Wells explains how climate issues are not being truthfully displayed. He argues they were being shown in a more accurate manner, more people would suffer climate anxiety and act in alarmist ways. Yeah, and this person further notes about the previous mass extinctions have been a result of greenhouse gases being released. I wasn't even aware that we were living through a mass extinction event currently. with that said, is even more frightening than individual changes we make to try to help really have no positive effects on the crisis. Well, they do have a positive effect on the crisis, but it's big, and it's really big. And the fact is, let's talk about this alarmist thing. So I'm not going to go too long today. Hopefully, with each of these deep dives, I'm going to go in an hour or so range. And I know it may seem like a lot, but remember, this is kind of the equivalent of what you'd be doing if you, kind of an aside here, but if you were taking this course and we were in Campbell Hall. In fact, last year when we took this course in Campbell Hall, people had to watch the little videos I did, like the one on climate and generation, but they had to do that on their own. But then when they came into Campbell Hall, what we did is what we're doing right now, going over the deep dives. So this is you actually coming to lecture in this weird asynchronous way. But is a question I posed, and many people responded, is David Wallace Wells an alarmist? Is that good or not? Well, as I noted in my framing material, we hesitated from, climate activists like myself, hesitated from trying to alarm the public. And there's been a sea change, certainly in the last 5 years, and David Wallace Wells is part of it, where, it's not trying to alarm the public, but trying to be realistic, right? So we are climate realists. And as a climate realist, the idea is lay out what could happen so that people would know. The problem is, this problem is so big and so scary that, again, you have the problem of people being petrified and not acting. That's different than the denial that my generation was in, the reason we didn't act. But it comes to the same. If we just don't act, then that's a problem, because now more than ever we have to act. It's at a crisis level. That's why we call it the climate crisis, which, as I think I noted in previous material, is sort of a rebranding of it in the last few years. But it is now. And David Wallace Wells brought attention to it, but there was a book out a few years ago. I'm trying to get the number of year. I think it's 4 years ago, called The Sixth Extinction, which actually won a Pulitzer, and it's about the fact that we are in the middle of a sixth extinction. But what this person specifically noted here is that 4 out of 5 of the extinction events in the past have come from this person quotes it exactly, have been a result of greenhouse gases. So we've had these mass extinction events before. Why that's a little surprising to people, I think, is because one of those, the number 5 here, it's not the 4 out of 5, but it's the exception, is the last one, the Jurassic event, which happened like 66 million years ago or so. And of course, that was the result, most likely, of an asteroid hitting the planet and bringing about climate change, by the way, as the climate became colder, which didn't favor cold-blooded animals. But in any event, that's the oddball one, right? But for the most part, 4 out of 5 were because of rise of greenhouse gases. We've inadvertently been pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere for the last 400 years or so, but especially in my lifetime. And we are now bringing about climate change that is not dissimilar to what brought about the other extinction events. And if you look at all the factors together, whether it's climate change or other factors like loss of habitat, and introducing toxic elements, toxic materials into the atmosphere and all, these are all bringing about extinction events everywhere. And, the oceans are a particularly good example, and it's, again, another one of these things that we don't think about. So when people think about the climate crisis, we think sea level rise. That's the ocean part. And that's not the ocean part. The ocean part is the oceans have been absorbing CO2, and that's been a good thing for us, as terrestrial-based life, because it's meant that the temperature hasn't risen as much as it would have. But they've been absorbing it, and the oceans have been absorbing both CO2 and heat. And as the temperature rises, certain animals in the ocean can't, survive. And furthermore, CO2 is absorbed directly when the ocean comes in contact with the atmosphere, which leads to ocean acidification. And ocean acidification is it's a more acidy ocean because more acidic ocean because of CO2. And other animals are very susceptible to that. They can't live in like an acidy, atmosphere that won't work for or environment, and that won't work for them. And an example would be something like coral. Coral it can't migrate to cooler places, and no place on the planet can escape no place in the oceans can escape the rise in acidity. So half of the coral on the planet is gone now. And there have been major events a few years ago. Huge portion of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia was killed, and that's called coral bleaching. And there's a really good documentary. I think it still streams on Netflix if you're curious, which is called Chasing Coral, and it's about that happening. But very soon in this century, certainly 90% of all coral on the planet is going to die. And this is another one of those things that we don't think about ocean life dying, about coral dying, but a huge portion of the planet's population relies on seafood for its for food, and specifically often for protein. 1 billion people rely on the coasts of the planet for getting a lot of their food and protein. But if I'm sure you know from high school and all how like a coral reef works. It's not just about coral, which is an animal there, which was kind of like a rock, but that's, things live in coral, animals live around coral, fish and all. The whole ecosystem is sort of defined in a certain respect by coral. When that goes away, those ecosystems will be radically disrupted and become far less effective at producing food. If people, thought of in that way. So that is a huge problem. And, again, wealthy country like the U.S. will get farmed fish, or we have obviously fishing operations that go out, off the coast, pretty far off and all, but yeah, it's an issue. And again, it's one of those things that people just don't think about, that we've thought about so many other issues. We just haven't focused on, rather we've thought about, primary issue like sea level rise. We haven't focused on all these other things. So you may not think, well, what does it have to do with with life in the ocean? What does life in the ocean really have to do with us? Well, it does. I mean, if you buy seafood, it probably came from, ecosystems that have, sort of been centered on coral and things. So this is an obvious problem. And I'm not going to go any longer. That's what Davis Wallace Wells wanted us to do. He wanted us to give us an indication of the different kinds of things that are possible. Maybe they won't all happen. He acknowledges they probably won't happen. Maybe they won't all happen as badly as they could. They probably won't. But some of it is happening. And I say that not in a future sense, but I mean now. When, on the other side of the mountain here from, Santa Barbara, where it hits 118 degrees, where Death Valley is at 118 degrees, as we'll see this week with, the fires in California, with flooding in Bangladesh and these other things. It's happening now. And I may have mentioned in a previous video, but I'll say it again. The climate crisis, people used to ask me about the climate crisis all the time. When's it going to start? That question doesn't make any sense anymore. It has started. It has been going on for well over a century, certainly a great deal in my lifetime. And we can no longer, I think any reasonable person can, if they look at the facts. And we're going to talk about climate change denial and why some people aren't looking at the facts and all. But you just can't deny it anymore. I mean, it is here. That doesn't mean that people, even who wouldn't deny it, don't have a problem. What I mean by that is, you may in a position to say that it's happening and all, but a lot of people, even when confronted with the facts, it's not so much. Well, one of the reasons that climate change denial works is, and we'll talk about this in detail, people are in a state of denial. It's a little different. One thing to deny that it's happening, but another thing is just denying that it could be happening. Something that my generation will probably never wrap our heads around is that we brought it about, that it happened in my lifetime, that we didn't make the changes necessary, and even worse, we continue to teach future generations generations, including your generation, to do the same exact things that we did. And if we would have made the changes and brought you up differently, cars out of the picture, with maybe largely plant-based diets and all of this, these were like headline stuff back when I was in high school. But we didn't make those changes, and we are, I think, largely as a generation in denial of what we did. And as a consequence, we're the other thing we'll talk about is not just denial now, but a term that AOC really brought into where people are talking about it, is delay. So denial is one thing, but even if you agree that it's happening, people are delaying action on it. I think what David Wallace Wells wanted to do is just to make very clear, even if all this isn't going to happen, and certainly not going to happen in the way that he suggested, but some of it is going to happen, and we can't delay. So when you have people like Bernie Sanders or AOC or Greta Thunberg or anyone really who has looked into this issue, saying we can't delay, it's a crisis, we have to deal with it. I think they're absolutely right. I think it's just very hard for some people to come to grips with the crisis. Okay, well, I will be subsequently recording another one of these, a deep dive, but I'll be looking at your comments on the film that we saw, which is Before the Flood, and an Inconvenient sequel. And I also hope you enjoyed this week's reading, but I want to end with something, and I'll just keep saying it, but yeah, I realize this is difficult material. I realize that, you're going to be getting smacked with one thing after another. So it was sort of a global issue with David Wallace Wells. This week, what you're reading and watching is going to be a local issue in California. It does get depressing. It is difficult, and, I don't know, you just want to scream or something. But remember, the way this course is structured, that will just be, and then next week is when we're going to see all the people trying to stop action on it and denying it, both fossil fuel affiliates and politicians. But when we get beyond that, it gets a lot better, because we can see just what we need to do and just how we can go about doing it. And we can do this. We can stop it. But it is going to be up to your generation. I think that's just the way it is. And what someone noted here, it's unfair, and it's absolutely unfair, but it is what it is. But you need to know what the situation is, and that's what we're doing now. And then once you fully understand the scope of it and all, we can kind of roll up our sleeves and get down to what we need to do, which will be the second 2/3 of the course. Okay, so that's it. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.